Hi everybody, welcome to week 6. This is the final week for this term. The last few weeks we've looked at the building blocks needed for this chapter 7 that we're finally going to be able to cover. So we're going to be looking at factor abundance, which we're going to link to the Heckscher-Oegland model. So let's do some admin stuff. Your module test, which is occurring in the first week when you come back, if I'm not mistaken. It is going to be on everything that is done in the first term. So that is week 1 to week 6 work. So that is all the models that you have built in terms of international trade. Right? Everything is inclusive. You will cover also tutorial 1 and tutorial 2 that you're currently busy with. So those are important. Why are the tutorials important? Because they are a bit of the maths element. So expect that there will be some mathematics inside your module test. There will also be some short questions. The short questions will be your standard comparisons of terms or theories and that. It will have a bit of that discussion. Please put those stuff in your own words. Do not copy and paste. And it might be phrased a bit different so that it's not something you just steal from a textbook in a sense. There are no MCQs, bear that in mind. But there are also some interesting short questions that you will get, which are a bit of a true and false scenario, but it's not really anything true. Everything will be false, and that you need to maybe explain why it is false. You must provide some discussion in that. Okay, so that is the important thing you need to take for your model test. It is a 3-hour test, normally speaking. You have to be sitting down. Since you're not sitting down on campus, the test will be allocated to 5 hours. It is to cater for those people who type slowly and to cater for in case there are graph work for you to do. Alright, so it's important that whatever you do, that you hand it out or hand it back to me in one document. Alright, if you decide to write down your test or something or do something that's on paper or something, then you need to take nice clear pictures, put it in one document so you can scan it or upload it in form of a Word document, but it needs to be a document that you need to upload. Yes, by all means, you're welcome to start and do all your questions inside a Word document and type out your answers and do your graphs using the tools that are in Word or other tools that you can get on a PC. It's up to you how you answer that form. But the way that you hand in is when you upload, it's one document, not 5, 7 things separately uploaded. It's one document that contains everything in a way that is easy to follow for the person that is marking your work. That is the most important thing. I would prefer you type everything, and I understand it is probably a bit difficult for some people to learn how to draw certain graphs inside Word if you're not being familiar with it. Then you can draw it on a picture, take a picture, scan that picture into your PC. The way you can do that, if you have WhatsApp on your PC and WhatsApp on your phone, then there's a way you can transfer that. But you can find some way. It should be, you should get familiar with trying to do that, of taking a picture of your work, uploading your document, get familiar with it, because you will be using it for your module test and for your exam in case you need to do. Do not copy a diagram from the internet and paste it as your diagram. It needs to be your own drawing, your own work. Right? That's very important. Do not copy anything. Don't be lazy. That's the most important thing. So spend some time learning how to do that process and get familiar with, especially if you're the type that's not familiar with typing and doing everything in a Word document. Okay, that's your model test. So summary, there's a bit of mathematics, a bit of short questions, and the rest of your paper will be structured questions. The structured questions will have a mix, mostly theory and mostly discussion, and will require probably a lot of graph drawing. Right? That's for your model test. No MCQs. And you must upload in one document. That is the summary of your model test scenario. In terms of exams, so by the end of this week, I would have set them up already. Yes, it's very early, I set them up. But so far, from what I've seen, and I will confirm this a bit later, but this should be generally what I will follow through with is there will be one essay in your exam. It will count a quarter of your paper. I expect you to type out that answer and not, please, and not, I don't know how else you would do it, but typing would probably be easier. But it should be a very well answered question. It should be a critical essay. It's a discussion on the information you have. So what does an essay normally entail? It has introduction, introduce what you're going to do, set the tone for what you're going to do and what you're going to cover. The rest of the work is then discuss all that work in a very logical form. Every paragraph must have some new idea or something that links to the previous paragraph. And then you end your thing by summarizing everything that you've done before and the conclusions that you can draw from your work. Right? But your middle content will come from your readings that we would do, or it would come from the theory you would do, or from the slides you have to do. So remember, you will have an essay for your exam. The rest of the 75% that is left over will be similar to your model test. So we'll have short questions, only little short questions, not too much actually compared to your model test weighting. And then the rest would be structured questions. In your structured questions, you can get a bit of maths, and you probably get a lot of bit of theory. But it's something you need to get familiar with, right? Alright, that's the most important thing is to take from. Don't forget, you have a essay also due shortly after your module test, maybe a week or 2 or 3 weeks after that. So take that into consideration, that you need to plan accordingly using your term break that is coming up. Just remember going forward, MCQs only appear in where? In your online test. So this week's online test will be MCQs again, and that will be similarly for online test 3 and online test 4. Your touch are what in their nature? They are mathematical in their nature, but they're not only mathematical. They can ask a bit of structured questions, they can. And they sometimes can ask you to explore certain things. The things that you need to explore that might not be in the text, that means not in your slides, not in your textbook, not maybe in additional information I gave you, it require you maybe a bit of research, they are also testable, right? I won't ask you anything outside the scope of what we covered, besides what would occur in a tutorial, which sometimes would have some explanatory findings you need to find, which is very rarely. I very rarely will ask you something very explorative. In part 1, what did I ask you to explore? The idea of the log linear model. Right, remember that? When I asked you what is happening in the A of the gravity model? So those are certain things that you will need to consider. Those things can be repeated. I will not ask you to explore anything in your exam that might be difficult to find. Usually speaking, it will be something, or 100% speaking, it would be something that you would have covered somewhere. And by covered, it does not necessarily mean in lectures. If I say chapter 1 is testable and I didn't cover it in a lecture, it's still testable because it was notified to you that you need to cover that. So as you notice, every week's work does not cover everything in the textbook for that chapter. So the rest of the stuff you need to go read through, and they can be testable. What is covered is the main things you need to know, especially considering if you move into ECO335. But that's enough aside, that's enough about your model test, and you're welcome to message me concerning this, email in the discussion forum, asking your tutors relay questions, and I have been getting some questions through the tutors from the students, and I've been answering, and they hopefully have responded with the questions they have been referring to me. All the best for your model test. Remember, I have time set if you need to do one-on-one discussions that are private. It's only me and you, no one else will be. It's only in a rare case if someone's asking the same question, I might ask them to join into the meeting. But remember, that is available on a Thursday afternoon if you need that one-on-one. If you want to join with a couple of friends and ask, also allowable. Just let me know. And if Thursday really doesn't work for you, then tell me Thursday doesn't work for me. Is a possibility to do that. Bear in mind, I'm going to probably put it in the morning, early morning. I need to do that, considering how my days usually look. Okay, all the best going forward. Let's actually start with the work now. So a brief overview. So what we're going to be doing in this chapter is looking at factor abundance and its relations into international trade. We're going to mostly do our analysis using PPFs. So we're going to be using production possibility frontiers. And you need to also know your Hegel-Oberlin theorem in this case. But in the case of the framework, what you need to understand, we have two goods, we have two factors of production, and we're dealing with two countries with identical homothetic preferences. The homothetic preferences is going to relate to demand, you need to understand that. And you need to also understand that the final good that a country exports uses the factor of production that is relatively abundant. What does that mean? If we have more labor relative to, or we have abundance of labor compared to very little capital, the final good that we export will be labor intensive. You also need to understand what it exports. Export is equal to supply minus demand. What is supply? Supply is the total production the country is making. What is demand? That is what our local consumers are actually wanting. So we need to find and we need to explain how to neutralize demand differences as a potential cause for trade flows to relate factor abundance and trade. So that's an important thing we're going to do. We're going to look at factor abundance and trade flows and look at this issue of the exports or the excess demand in a sense from the outside world, not from the local world. And then we're going to use this, we're going to do our explanations using profit maximization by producers, and then we're going to use utility maximization by consumers, which are stuff that you would cover on a micro sense. So you would cover that in third year micro, and you would cover that possibly in second year micro, if I'm not mistaken, but it's mostly a third year micro. And you'll cover this at an honest level. And then ultimately we want equilibrium. We demand equal supply. Alright, so we need to, our excess demand from the outside world or the exports that we have to do has to meet the demand that's coming from the outside world. Very, very important to take into consideration. So once local demand has been made, the excess supply that we have must entirely and all of them must be taken up from foreign demand. Otherwise, there are some adjustments that needs to occur to meet that. Otherwise, we are producing too much or too little if we cannot meet the demand coming from a foreign side. So that is something that we need to consider and that we will cover over the slides over time. When we deal with consumer maximization or utility maximization, then we're dealing with the idea of looking at what utility is appropriate for fixed income. So in our case, the income line, or it is relative to your budget line in a sense, is the red line. And what the relationship does that gives us? It gives us the relationship of prices, or its slope is the price of manufacturers divided by the price of food. That is the most important thing you need to take in consideration. Then you also need to know what is the slope of, or what is the gradient of what? The utility curve. You need to know that the gradient of the utility curve is referred to the marginal rate of substitution. And what is important about this? Unlike the income line, which has a fixed slope, because the utility curve is convex, it has a variable slope. At each point along the line, the marginal rate of substitution will change. And this is not micro. I'm not going to ask you if it's increasing or decreasing returns. Why is it this and that? That is not the most important thing that we need to consider for now. All right? It's a micro concepts. What we need to consider is, okay, what is the maximum income? I mean, what is the maximum utility we can get for a certain amount of income? So in our case here, that red line, which is your income line, determines the amount of food, amount of manufacturers that you will consume. So it can be anywhere along that red line or below the red line. Why below the red line? Because you can decide I don't want to spend my whole income. But we're not dealing with the idea that we don't want to spend our whole income. We're saying we have a fixed income. I want to gain the maximum utility that I can gain for that income. So we have these utility curves, and they are increasing when they move towards the top right corner. So only at that point where your utility curve is tangent, sorry, I was looking for that word. So only where your utility curve is tangent to the income red line will that be your point of utility maximization. And that is the point where your marginal rate of substitution is also equal to the prices, the relative prices, or your slope of your income line. That is the most important thing. Any utility curve below that means you're not spending your entire income. There's some income that you can still spend to gain more food and gain more manufactures. And if you are eating more food and you have more manufacture in life, that means you're actually getting more utility. We're obviously assuming that there is no negative utility when you consume more. So everything that you consume in addition is always going to give you more utility. There's no point in you come and you say, okay, I cannot consume anymore, I'm actually going to get more negative utility. When would that occur? When would that negative utility occur? Think about it and ponder about it. But something like a person who's full. If he's eating enough food and he keeps stuffing his mouth in with more food and more food and more food, beyond the point where he possibly can eat, then he's actually going to get to a point where he's going to get negative utility, where he's going to feel sick and all these funny things in that. So that is something to consider, but it won't be something that will be brought in a model. So we just deal with the standard models. So all in all, what you need to consider here is when you're dealing with utility maximization, it is when the utility curve is tangent to your income line. And that point there is when your marginal rate of substitution is exactly equal to your relative prices that is determined by your income line. Important, right? Any other point not representing where the marginal rate of substitution is equal to your relative prices, that point is not utility maximizing. So we need to consider that going forward. So when you deal with homothetic preferences, it's the whole idea that if my food and manufactures were to double, so I consume double food and double manufactures, then my utility would also double. And how will you relate that? You relate that in terms of your income line. When the income line or your amount of income that you have doubles, what happens? Your income is only doubling. It's not changing the slope of your line. So then that will just be your rightward shift of your income line, which would then be associated with utility increasing also by a factor of 2, also doubling. So that is an important thing that you need to consider. That's the same thing as constant returns. When the inputs double, then the amount of production also double. Nothing different. So homothetic preferences is almost like constant returns to scale of production, but just called homothetic preferences. And all in all, when you have this idea of homothetic preferences and constant returns to scale, then we're dealing with functions that are homogeneous of degree 1. And when functions are usually homogeneous of degree 1, they're usually written in what form? They usually then come in the form of a Cobb-Douglas function. And that makes the mathematics a lot easier because we can use logs when we're dealing with Cobb-Douglas functions, when we're dealing with the mathematics and the statistics side. For us, the theories here are more important and we're not dealing with that mechanics at the moment. So what you need to take from homothetic preferences, increasing proportions in income lead to the same increase in proportion in terms of utility. And that increase in proportion income is the same increase in proportion of the amount of food that you consume and manufactures. And what that means is that your food relative to manufacturers ratio stays the same. So that is why you have this green expansion line. A, B, and C has the same ratio of food is to manufacturers. And how is that determined? Purely by the slope of your income line. Right? And how tangent it is to your marginal rate of substitution. That is maintained along the income expansion line. So homothetic preferences does not alter the marginal rate of substitution equaling to your slope of your income line. It maintains that relationship throughout. All in all, we need to know what our profit maximization is. This is where our marginal rate of transformation is the same as our price ratio, which is the price of manufacturers divided by the price of food. And the same thing for utility maximization. The marginal rate of substitution, when we do that maximization, must then also equal to your price ratio. All in all, that then means that your marginal rate of transformation needs to be equal to your margin rate of substitution when we're dealing with equilibrium, which we will see a bit later. You also need to remember your homothetic preferences, that income expansion line, which is a straight line, and how that slope of the expansion line is determined is exactly related to what your price ratio is. When your price ratio is a certain amount, it determines the ratio of food in relation to your manufacturers that you will consume. And that is maintained along the income expansion path. So in end, you will be given your prices. Your prices will be given to you. It's something that's given to you. From that, what does that determine? That determines the demand for goods that is consumed based on your total income. Also, that prices determines what? What's the production side, and we can see that a bit later. From your production side, we have the green concave line. The green concave line is your PPF, the maximum combination of food and manufacturers that you can use once you fully utilize all your labor and capital. And the point of production maximization is going to occur when the red line, which is your cost line, is tangent to your PPF. The red line represents your ratio of prices, and the green line represents your marginal rate of transformation. And remember here, the marginal transformation changes, or the value is different at every point on the PPF. While on the cost line, the red line, the ratio of prices remains the same. Any line, red line, or any cost line that is below your PPF is a point where not enough budget has been allocated for you to utilize all your factors of production that is available. And that means then that you are producing at a level where not all your factors of production are fully employed. Now, depending on what you're looking at, right, there's two types of analysis. You can either say, this is the maximum budget I have. What is the maximum I can produce? But that is not the question we're asking. We're saying, this is the maximum production that I want to produce. What is the lowest cost it's going to take me to produce it? And that is that maximum red line on the far right. That's the analysis we're looking. Any red line below that is a point where I am not producing at the maximum based on my resources. Any red line to the right of that point of tangency is the point where I can produce all the production on the green line, but I'm spending more in terms of production than I need to. So I'm overspending in a sense. So therefore your point of tangency between your cost line and your PPF is the point of equilibrium from the production side. And that coincides with your marginal rate of transformation being the same as your ratio of prices. So we're moving to the idea of the Revsivsky lines. So we need to relate factor intensity, the Revsivsky theorem, and PPF. The Revsivsky theorem relates factor intensity and production. So what it says is, if there's an increase in inputs, it causes the PPF to shift outward. But the outward shift will be larger on the side of the good that uses that input more intensively. So for instance, if the stock of labor increases, then the PPF shifts outward, but it will shift outwardly larger on the side where food is, because that is the good that uses labor more intensively, according to the foundations we have built. The relationships between factor intensity, factor abundance, and production give rise to the Revsivsky lines in the final good space. So we'll have a capital Reb line and a labor Reb line. So from now on, I will be using the word Reb to make our life more easier and not to get my tongue tied when I say Revsivsky. So let's look at a depiction of the Revsivsky line. So in our first circumstance here, we have a standard PPF and we have the cost line. So we're just looking from the production side. What happens now? We have labor or capital increasing. So based on our graph, what you can see, the shift is where it is larger on the manufacturer side. So in our instance, we had the capital stock increasing, causing the PPF to shift outwards. When the PPF shifts outwards, the shift was larger on the manufacturer side, which is the good, which is more capital intensive. So all we need to do to depict that existing line is to track the profit maximization points. So those are the points where the PPF is tangent to the cost line, where the green curve is tangent to the red line. So previously, when there was no change in capital as we were discussing earlier, then we would have been at the leftward dot, black dot with a yellow in the middle. Now, with the capital stock increasing, we had a rightward shift, and now the new point of tangency using the same relative prices would now be a bit to the right and a bit lower where it was originally. And if you pull a line through all these points, these dots, then you would basically be forming the Rosinsky line. Obviously, you can do another shift, another outward shift, so maybe capital increased again, and we'll find that with a new capital increasing and the new point of tangency, it will lie on that same line. So you only really need to do one shift, and it kind of shows the direction in which the new profit maximization points would be. So basically, the resulting line tracks the profit maximization points for changes in capital or in labor. If it's tracking when labor is changing, then we have the capital rib line. If it is tracking where labor is changing, then we have the labor rib line. This is important to know, right? And that can easily form a nice, easy MCQ question. Now we're going to try to look at the HM model. So we're going to first look at this from an autarky perspective. From a production side, it shouldn't be surprising that our cost line is tangent to our PPF. So at point A is where we actually produce. Nothing strange. When we introduce the consumption side, what do we know? That our utility line is tangent to our income line, which is point B. Right? This is a totally separate analysis, right? This is when the economy is closed. But what do we recognize about both of these points? Firstly, the ratio of prices was equal to the marginal rate of transformation when we were looking in terms of production. Here we find the marginal rate of substitution equal to the ratio of prices. So what does that mean? So when they are equal, where can they coincide? They can only coincide at point AB. AB needs to be the same point. So where AB is the same point is the place under autarky where the marginal rate of substitution and the marginal rate of transformation is the same. Anywhere else possible, right? Cannot be possible. Why? Why is that not possible to be at any other point? Why is B landing up in point A? And why is A landing up at point B? Why is it not A to the left and B to the right? What is happening? The amount of food that you are producing is exactly the amount of food that you are consuming in your country. And the amount of manufactures that you are producing is exactly the amount of consumption that is occurring in terms of manufactures. And if A and B does not coincide, then what does that mean? We have excess. But this is autarky. There cannot be excess. So they must lie on the same point. And it happens to be that, not happens to be, but based on the mathematics, the marginal rates are the same in terms of the transformation and the substitution in terms of the ratio of prices. So that is autarky. Very simple. But we're talking about trade. So we know we need to open up the economy to trade. And this is where the discussion is going to move to. When we move to free trade, there's something different that now occurs. You must understand that the marginal rate of substitution equal to the marginal rate of transformation equal to the ratio of prices holds for each country. But that does not mean that the ratio of prices in both countries is the same. That does not mean that the marginal rate of substitution in both countries are the same. And that does not mean that the marginal rate of transformation is the same for both countries. The equation or the proposition or the point of tangent is true for each country, but they do not coincide at the same point of production and consumption for both countries. Those differ. Okay, that's important to know. Yes, there is a possibility that they both have exactly the same spot, but that is very rare. That same spot where they consume the same, they produce the same. All that you need to know is that this marginal rate of transformation equal to marginal rate of substitution holds for each country, but does not mean that the values are the same between both countries. You know? So what happens now when they open to the world? So now when free trade occurs, what happens? Because they have these differences in what the marginal rate of substitution is and what the marginal rate of transformation is between countries, it allows actually for trade. So let's assume that the new red line now represents what the world prices is, or the prices that is now being decided between the two countries. So we have this new red line. What happened initially under autarky? Under autarky, we were producing what? Food and manufacturing goods, here represented by FBR, AU, and MPR, AU. That is a production. PR stands for production, AU stands for autarky. Right? So we are on the point that was on the right and the left, which is the point of tangency of the green curve and the blue curve, the production curve and the utility curve. That was where we were initially. Now, when the economy opens, there is new world prices, and because there's new world prices, there's a new slope, right? And it happens to be, we're just choosing that it's more horizontal line. Where does production occur? Production has to occur at the point when the marginal rate of transformation needs to equal the new world prices. Right? So that is now the dot on the green curve, but the one that's on the left, on the top left hand side. So that's represented by FBR FT and MPR FT, which is the food and the manufacturing production for free trade. Now we need to come to ideas. Okay, now we're producing at a totally different spot than we were producing under autarky. What does that mean in terms of our demand side? Where are we consuming? Where is our utility now present? And this is the discussion that we need to do next. But what do we need to know? The marginal rate of substitution and the marginal rate of substitution and the ratio of prices needs to be equal. And we'll move to that next. So now we did discuss earlier, under free trade, we still need to keep the equilibrium going where the ratio of prices was the same as the marginal rate of transformation, right? So that is on the green curve, on the PPF, the far left top point, right? That's the one is represented by FBR FT and MPR FT. Your free trade, not your free trade, your food and your manufacturing products or production under free trade. Okay, now we need to find what is our point of consumption. So where does consumption occur? Consumption will occur where the marginal rate of substitution and the ratio of prices are equal, where the income line and utility line is tangent. So that is occurring at the point FCon FT and MCon FT, which is the food and the manufacturing demand from the consumption side on free trade. So that is on the top green line, that dot there. The point where they are actually converging, the red line, or not converging, where they're tangent, the red line and the blue line. That is our point of consumption. So how do you describe that? What is happening actually? How can we analyze that point? So you need to know this. Are we consuming more manufacturers, or are we consuming more food at our new consumption point? So we need to draw a comparison from the production point under free trade and from the income point from free trade. Sorry, we need to draw a comparison from a production side and from a consumption side under free trade. Where are we producing? We're producing on the leftward point on the green line, and we're consuming on the only dot that exists on the upper blue line. Okay, so the difference is there in terms of our food production and our food consumption will determine our exports and imports, and the difference is there in terms of our manufacturing production and our manufacturing consumption will determine our imports and exports. So let's look at it in terms of the food. So at the point of consumption, the amount of food that we're consuming is less than the amount of food that we are producing in our country. So what does that mean? If we're consuming less than what we're producing, that means we must be exporting the rest to the other country. What is it in terms of our manufacturing goods? In terms of our manufacturing goods, our consumption value, our MCON FT, is more than the manufactured goods under production. That is only possible if we are actually importing that amount. So in a sense, our food exports that we're making or that we are selling are then buying us our manufacturing imports. So remember that is some of the discussion that you always need to do. You need to talk about, okay, this is the amount of exports that was derived and imports derived because of the differences of where we were producing initially and from where we are consuming now under free trade. Remember, under autarky, they landed up at the same spot, so there was no differences. So to summarize, what you need to understand is that prices adjust in the free trade to ensure that world consumption equals world production. And that is because of the differences between our marginal rate of transformation and our marginal rate of substitution between the two countries. And that determines the world prices. So we took it as given, but that is directly because of the price adjustment that is trying to force the equilibrium. And that is because of what differences? Transformation and substitution marginal rates differences. So what we can then show that there is actually gains from moving from autarky. What I didn't say on the previous line is, if we look in terms of utility now, we're actually on a higher utility curve. So on this higher utility curve, there has been gain to society. So society, through the interaction of free trade, of trading, has been able to move onto a higher utility curve and gain. And we're still on the same PPF curve. So with the same production, we can get more utility from entering into free trade. An important thing that you need to know, and this is something we've been emphasizing, the marginal rate of transformation is exactly equal to the price ratio. That is to maintain profit maximization. And the marginal rate of substitution is exactly equal to the price ratio, and that is to maintain utility maximization. And in the end, what happens is then the world demand is equal to the world supply. So what we find under autarky in free trade is that the margin rate of transformation and the margin rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio. And we find that demand and supply is equal under both scenarios. Unfortunately, under the first circumstance, when we had autarky, the domestic demand had to equal to the domestic supply. Now, although when we decided under free trade, that we found that that is no longer the case. We didn't need to have that assumption, or we didn't need to have that occurring. So then we had the idea that we could actually consume different from our production under free trade. And in the end, it led to more utility, which in essence is more welfare gains. So now we're going to actually use that analysis to move forward and look at the HO model or the HO theorem. And we're going to relate trade flows, factor abundance, and factor intensity to each other. So what we're going to do from here on is take two countries, country A and country B. We're going to assume country A has more labor stock than country B, which has more capital stock. So the relative labor to capital ratio will be higher in country A, or the relative capital to labor will be lower in country A. What that means is that our PPF is going to look a bit more thinner and taller. And we're going to find that the point of production is going to be at a place where the amount of food produced is a lot more higher than the amount of manufactures produced relatively than if we were compared the food and the manufacturing ratio of country B. Country B has a biased PPF towards the manufacturing side because of the higher capital to labor ratio, or the higher capital stock when compared to country A, which had a higher labor stock. So in essence, what we're doing is showing the comparison of trade between a country which has a higher labor stock and a country that has a higher capital stock. And we're going to put both these graphs onto one diagram now. So both country A and country B's PPFs on the same graph with their respective utility curves. Don't forget, a lot of this work is based on your previous chapters. So a lot of your building blocks. Over here we merged both graphs. So you should always remember that a country that has a higher labor to capital stock, the production level that they're going to land up with would generally mean that the amount of food relative to manufacturers would be higher than in a case where a country was more capital intensive, meaning they have a higher capital stock relative to labor, and they will find themselves on a production possibilities curve, or at a production level where manufacturers will be a lot more relative to the food level. So these are things that you need to know, and this is depicted by the green dotted line, which is showing the labor intensive movement, and the green dotted line, which is showing the capital intensiveness of country B. So we just merged both graphs, nothing special happening here. We put them on the same set of axes, and this is still kind of autarky in a sense. We're still showing the green things still represent the prices, or the price ratio for country A, and the utility curve for country A, and the production curve for country A. And the blue things still depict the utility curve for country B, and the price ratio for country B, and the production possibilities curve for country B. It's just the merging of the two previous graphs. There is no real discussion. I'm just showing how they would look when they put on the same set of axes. And the free trade, what we find now is that the ratio of prices lies between the ratio of prices for country A and country B. For country A, that means the ratio of prices under free trade is less than the ratio of prices that would have been under autarky. What does that mean in terms of a diagram? That means that the income line or the ratio of prices line is now flatter or less steeper. In terms of the diagram, that is relate then to a new production at level A or production A and a new consumption level of consumption A. But what does the terms analysis mean? Well, how do we interpret this? Because the ratio of prices under free trade is less than the ratio of prices under autarky for country A, what it has mean is that the price of food has increased relative to the price of manufacturers. What does that signal to the producers? From a producer's perspective, if the food price is increasing, they are going to shift their resources in such a way that they will produce more food and produce less manufacturers. Why? Think of this from a profit perspective. Are you going to make more money by selling a cheaper good or more expensive good? From a producer perspective, you're going to make more money from selling a more expensive good, hence why we're shifting our production to that more expensive good. What does that mean from a consumption perspective, from a consumer perspective? What has increased? The price of food. The price of food has become more expensive than the price of manufacturers relatively. And from a consumer perspective, I am more likely to spend my money on something that is becoming cheaper than something that is becoming more expensive. So since food is becoming more expensive, I'm going to buy less of that and more of the other good. And that is shown by the dot represented by con A, consumption A. That relates now to a lower consumption of food and a higher consumption of manufacturers that had been under autarky, while production A now relates to a higher amount of food being produced and a lower amount of manufacturers being produced than had been under autarky for country A. So now we are producing more food than we are actually consuming in our country. That means we're actually going to export some good. And in terms of consumption, we are consuming more manufacturers than we are actually producing in the country than it had been under autarky, meaning that we're going to import that amount. That is represented by the red triangle that you can see. That is the discussion about the exports and imports that would have been normally under autarky, which didn't exist. So now we're going to move to the analysis and break it down for country B. For country B, we find that the ratio of prices is more under free trade than it had been under autarky. What this relates to is a more steeper line, meaning that your new point of tangency between your PPF or your PPC or your production possibilities curve or your production possibilities frontier is now at a more rightward position on your PPF. So this is the point of tangency between your ratio of prices under free trade, the red line here, and your PPF. So that is at product B. But with this newer, higher, steeper ratio of prices, your consumption point now is now at consumption B. This represents a higher utility curve than had been under autarky. But in terms of the discussion on how we land to this point, we need to discuss this in terms of relative prices. Since the ratio of prices under free trade is more than the ratio of prices under autarky for country B, it means that the relative prices of manufacturers is more expensive or has risen relative to the prices of food. That is, the prices of manufacturers has increased relative to the prices of food as a repetition. So what does the increase in manufacturers in the price of manufacturers mean for producers? A higher price for a product relative to another product means that the production for that higher price product will increase. Producers want to make more money, so they're more likely to produce the product that sells for more. So they shift their resources in order to produce more manufacturers and less food. What does it mean from a consumption point? The price of manufacturers is increasing relative to the price of foods. What does that do for consumers? For consumers, what they do is they're going to buy the cheaper product. The product that is becoming cheaper relative. Or they're going to not buy the product that is becoming more expensive. So they're going to shift away their consumption from the more expensive good, which is the manufacturers, to the cheaper good, which is food. What this entails is that then via that substitution away from the more expensive good of manufacturers to the more cheaper good of food, they will eventually land up at a point con B. So this is on the higher utility curve. So as we discussed earlier, we looked at the analysis outside of trade. We just looked at it in terms of what happens in price changes with the much earlier graphs. So this is important. You need to be able to discuss how the relative price changes under free trade affects production and consumption verbally and in terms of a graph. So remember earlier the discussion was more like, oh, we needed to ensure that the marginal rate of transformation is equal to the ratio of prices. Oh, we need to make sure the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the ratio of prices. That was the early discussion. And you can also talk about it in this, but you need to also discuss a bit more detail in terms of the shifting of production and that. I deliberately earlier did not speak about how the shifts in production occurs because of prices and the shifts in the production occurs between a utility in consumption, because I wanted to leave it for this analysis later. It would have been boring to repeat the same thing twice, which I probably have done a bit. All in all, this is now when both graphs is put together, and this is what is expected from you, is to be able to put both graphs on the same set of axes and do the same discussion as we done separately for both, but just using the one graph. It's not too hard, we just broke it up so it was easier to discuss, but the whole discussion would have occurred using the one graph. Important to know, I didn't discuss the exports and imports of country B, but any difference, what you should be able to have said then is that because they're producing more manufacturers than they would have under autarky, and they're consuming more food than they would have done under autarky for country B, we find that country B would be exporting the excess manufacturers where to country A, and country B would be importing the food that they're not able to produce within country B from country A. And if you look at it further, the amount that is exchanged, the amount of food that travels to country A is exactly the excess, the amount of food that travels to country B is exactly the excess that existed in country A. So the import of food by country B equals the export of foods from country A. And the export of manufacturers by country B equals the imports of manufacturers from country A. And in that way, we ensure that the total demand of both countries is equal to the total production of both countries. And this doesn't occur by accident. This occurs because the relative prices has changed in such a way that it would handle the excess supply and demand of each country to equate them under free trade. What you should take back in terms of maximization is that profit maximization implies the margin rate of transformation is the same as the price ratio. Utility maximization implies that the margin rate of substitution is the same as the price ratio. In equilibrium, demand always meets supply, or they are equal. That occurs both in autarky and under free trade. Under autarky, the amount is produced is exactly the amount is consumed. But under free trade, it's on a world level that it meets demand equals to supply, because what we find that within specific countries that there's an excess demand for certain product and an excess production of a certain product. So that is important to remember. We also should remember that any rise in input shifts the PPF outward, and the shift is larger in the direction of the good that uses this input intensively. And we showed the results in production lines earlier. You also need to remember under free trade, a country exports the good that uses, under free trade, a country exports the good that uses the relative abundance factor of production relatively intensely. That's what we show on our last few slides, and we broke up the countries individually. And we find also that for both countries, they gain from free trade. Why? Because we are consuming at a higher level, which means more welfare. So what is different? What can you say in terms of the difference then from our comparative advantage model and from our HR model? Is it complete specialization? Think about it. It might come in the form of an MCQ or your test. What do I mean by complete specialization? Something to ponder about. Think about it, research it, figure it out, read in the textbook. Good luck. This is the end of this week's class. And I think you have a term break, and then I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. All the best. You have now all the material needed, all the discussion material needed in terms of lectures and slides going forward for the term test that's coming up for your module test. And if you fully understand your theory, you should be okay. If you're okay with the touch, you should be okay. If you need help with any of that, those stuff, maybe you need to go over the explanation, and maybe you want to do even more deeper breakdown of the graphs and that, then pop me email. We can tell me what is the issue you have in the email, and I'll set up some time to discuss with you. It's not a problem. All the best.